Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson. David Swenson is taking a break. I have the honor today of talking with one of my old dear friends, Hal Bidlack of Colorado Springs. Hal, among other things, was a U.S. Air Force officer. He taught at the U.S. Air Force Academy. He's more recently a political columnist and a historian. Hal, welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Wonderful to be back.
Is that a fair assessment of your bio?
I think so. Air Force, and 25 years as a military officer teaching at the Air Force Academy, and a few things since then.
Now you are writing a weekly column?
Twice weekly.
For?
It's a thing called Colorado Politics. It's an interesting blend of the old and the new. They took a newspaper that was a weekly political commentary that went back 140 years in Colorado and blended it with an online presence to create this new thing, which is still a weekly publication, but also a website. So I publish to the website twice weekly and to the print edition whenever they need more room to wrap fish.
And if people want to go read some of what you've written, where can they go?
They can go to coloradopolitics.com, and that's where it lives.
So we're here to talk about none other than Alexander Hamilton.
Fine topic.
Among other things, you are a Hamilton pretender, a performer, an impersonator, a reenactor. Which is your favorite term?
The audience should know that it's entirely your fault. We got to know each other when I saw years ago, when I was in charge of the Introduction to American Government class at the Air Force Academy. I saw one of your performances on C-SPAN, and I reached out to your agent to see, and we ultimately brought you to talk to the entire 1,100 cadets taking that introductory class as Thomas Jefferson. And we kind of struck a good friendship up that I've treasured over the decades. And you actually are the one who convinced me to do Hamilton. I always tell people it's because you wanted someone to argue with. You were tired of having everyone love Jefferson. So you wanted someone to call you out.
Well,
and we did our very first debate was when you came to the Academy to help lead our, what we call the Academy Assembly, an international assemblage once a year of students from all around the world to talk about strategic issues. And you were one of our table leaders, and we did an evening debate. And that was over 25 years ago, and it's been a delight to do it ever since. But I always give you credit as my mentor.
Well, thank you for that. So my first question is a really difficult one, but are you yourself a Hamiltonian?
I think the answer is kind of. When you look back at the Founding Fathers, my sense is that many of them offered wisdom, but not all in one place or at any one time. And so we really need to accept, for example, Jefferson's notion that the earth belongs to the living, I think is a vitally important thing to remember when we talk about the issues of today. But Hamilton's understanding of the importance of a society based on a mechanical economy and not farming, I think was visionary. So mostly I agree with Hamilton. If I were to steal your words, I would say that I am a Hamiltonian with a Jeffersonian veneer that isn't very thick.
So let's define what it is to be a Hamiltonian. I think it starts with human nature.
Absolutely. When I do my solo shows, I begin and I kind of lay out a few things of Hamilton's past and his history. I found that at the end of it, I say, now all of these issues on which Jefferson and Hamilton disagreed come down to one fundamental difference. Jefferson believed that people are basically good, and if government gets out of the way, greatness is possible. Hamilton believed, as he said in Federalist Number 6, that man is ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious, and that with proper governance and controls, greatness is possible. And I think they're both right. It just varies on issue and time and context.
All right. So Hamilton, I think, believed that human beings are extraordinarily energetic and ambitious, but that can lead to difficulties, and that you need government to rein in what he called the lusts and passions of mankind. Does that work for you?
Yes, I think that's fair to say.
And Hamilton believed that this country was going to be a great nation, and to be a great nation, you need a strong government, a central government.
Yes.
You need a military, and you need a vibrant economy that gets on board with the capitalist and banking innovations of the 17th and 18th centuries. Is that fair?
And I would add also a understanding of the importance of international relations. Didn't Jefferson once say that he wished the United States to be a fourth or fifth rate country like China that the world would leave us alone. I think Hamilton would have argued to be at the leading edge of international diplomacy and international activity.
So as I look at it from the year 2023, so that's a couple of hundred years ago now, Hal, it seems to me that for all that's beautiful and idealistic and noble in Thomas Jefferson, he simply got it wrong. That if you look at the trajectory of the United States from 1787 until 2023, we have not been an agrarian utopia. We're not a particularly well-educated country. The people don't pay a lot of attention to government. The people are not eternally vigilant, that Americans live for prosperity and freedom and opportunity, and Americans are quite comfortable with our advanced and aggressive place in the world's arena. And so from that point of view, Hamilton was right, and Jefferson appears almost like a novelist or a fiction writer, right?
I think that's correct in large measure. And you note that, as we've often talked about, when as president, Jefferson, much to his regret, I think, but nonetheless because it was the right thing to do, engaged in a number of Hamiltonian behaviors, the Louisiana Purchase certainly being the most demonstrably wonderful of all of those. And yes, I think that it's interesting to look through time. I think Hamilton's view of human nature is closer. But I also, when I was teaching at the academy, we would talk about about half of Americans vote in elections. And I actually have a good friend from another part of my life involved in astronomy that is proud of the fact he doesn't vote. He says, I don't care about politics. I don't vote. It's not my business. And I would argue to my cadets sometimes, mostly to see if they would argue back, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, that one of the signs of a strong country is when people can risk not giving a darn about their government. That for most of human history, you had to be quite aware of the government for your own personal welfare, be it a king, a pharaoh, or a potentate, or whatever. In the United States, you can risk not caring about the government because your fundamental rights are not often at tremendous risk. And I think the last 4 years suggest something slightly different. But what would you think of that argument, that not voting is a sign of the strength of a country?
Yes, I think so. I think Americans are largely apolitical, but the events of the last, say, 6 years,
yeah, that's a better. Yeah.
Since Donald Trump came down the escalator at Trump Tower, have forced us to pay attention to government in a way that we hadn't for a very long time, I think.
I agree. And I think that shows that what worries me is that our institutions are not as strong as I thought. In a column not too long ago, I said we just have to accept now that we have 3 political branches of government. With the Trump appointees to the Supreme Court, it has become, not entirely, and certainly not on the small, tedious measures the Supreme Court often has to decide on, but on broad issues like Roe, the Supreme Court has become a political arm of government.
We're talking in the special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour with Hal Bidlack, formerly a political science professor at the U.S. Air Force Academy, now a historian, a columnist, and a Hamilton impersonator. So going back to the Louisiana Purchase for a moment, and I don't want to debate with you today. I just really want to clarify these issues. We get plenty of chances to debate.
We're not wearing our wigs, so we can just discuss it as friends.
So when Jefferson purchased the territory, 828,000 square miles, 575 million acres for 3 cents per acre, Hamilton said something like, "Why'd you do that? We could have just sent troops." Is that true?
Yes. Hamilton argued that for the 14.2 million, you could raise an army of 25,000 soldiers, equip them for 25 years. And he would argue that Bonaparte could not in any way use, defend, or exploit the technically French property. In fact, he went farther and argued that after the army took the Louisiana territory, he proposed what he called a filibuster into Florida to expel the Spanish. And I think this is one where, as Hamilton, of course, I make a strong case for it, but I think as Hal, I say Hamilton was wrong. Jefferson was incredibly wise to take the admittedly Hamiltonian step of seeing beyond the explicit powers in the Constitution to double the size of the United States with a stroke of his pen. This was a brilliant move by Jefferson.
I agree. But I guess what I find so interesting, Hal, is that just on the logic of it, I would think that anybody would say, if you can buy an empire for 3 cents per acre, it'd be foolish to send troops. I mean, that this is a really extraordinarily good thing to do, because peace is always to be preferred to war.
I think that shows the importance of Hamilton's background, his youth, growing up in the Caribbean, as John Adams colorfully said, the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler, parents that were in love but not married because his mother was forced into a marriage against her will as a young girl of 16 to a vile man she ultimately fled. Hamilton's own father leaving on a business trip of 3 months that extended some 35 years, and he never saw him again. So Hamilton grows up in desperate poverty, where his bastard status bars him from lots of actions in the community, but he's absolutely brilliant. He wrote a letter about a hurricane that came through when he was 18, and it was so well written, everyone assumed it was an older person, and they were shocked to find out this 18-year-old lad had these language skills. But Hamilton saw the military, I think, as one of the very few ways in which a person born into his circumstance could rise in society. And I think and then as the commander, first of all, as George Washington's aide de camp, after his own personal service as a captain of artillery in the Revolutionary War, his command of all U.S. military forces during the quasi-war with France in 1798, where he was basically put in charge because Washington would only take command if an invasion occurred. But Hamilton, I think, had a tendency to think of things militarily first. And I will admit, as a retired military officer, especially looking at something like Ukraine, my thoughts tend to military action fairly quickly on some things. I think I'm tempered by that, but I think perhaps Hamilton's background helps us understand his predisposition to military force.
Hal, it's time to take a short break. I'm really enjoying our conversation here. You nearly slipped into character there a little bit. Right, I'll pull you back from time to time.
You.
This is Hal Bidlack, formerly a professor of political science at the U.S. Air Force Academy, now a writer, historian, and newspaper columnist. We'll take a short break. We'll be back. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson. David Swenson is taking a break. I'm talking with one of my old and dearest friends, Hal Bidlack of Colorado Springs. Hal, among many other things, is an impersonator of the life and character of Alexander Hamilton. Hal, so Hamilton is born in the Caribbean, born in obscurity. He comes to this country sponsored by merchants who read that extraordinary piece he wrote about the hurricane and realized there's a young man of real talent here, maybe genius. He needs to get an education on the continent. He needs to go to the United States, to the colonies. So they send him. He attempts to kind of force his way quickly through Princeton. They won't allow it. He then goes to King's College instead, which is now Columbia. He accelerates his educational pace. By all accounts, he's an absolutely brilliant young man. He has a great capacity to absorb information. He's also a gifted prose stylist, as we see from that letter about the hurricane that he wrote. He attaches himself to one of the most prominent families in New York, the Schuyler family, and he attaches himself to the most important American, George Washington. And clearly Washington saw something extraordinary in young Hamilton. He didn't trust many people, and he certainly came to trust Hamilton first as an aide-de-camp, and then essentially as his prime minister, although technically the secretary of the Treasury in his administration. It's a pretty amazing rags to riches story. Have you seen the musical Hamilton?
I have. Oddly enough, I was being asked to do a Hamilton show in San Antonio, Texas, several years ago. And as part of the inducement to get me to come, they offered to toss in tickets to the musical, which was being performed in the theater across from where I was going to perform. So my wife, Dana, and I actually went down and had a wonderful time and saw the musical, which I always point out is not a documentary, but is fine entertainment.
And it gets the essence of this
does.
person who he had to make his way in the world by the sheer force of his personality, his drive, and his talents. Whereas someone like Jefferson, for all of his genius, was born into privilege and was part of the establishment class just by virtue of being born. That wasn't true of Hamilton.
No, and that becomes literally his fatal flaw. His sense of honor was so prickly that he could not stand a single assault on it without it really getting under his skin. And the whole story of how the duel with Burr happened is a long one, far too long to relate here. You know, Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, Adams, the founding generation, I would say, you would know this better than I, but virtually all of them were engaged in affairs of honor in some way, which is what could lead to a duel, where they were simply able, because of their strength of character, to ignore it. Whereas Hamilton could not let the offense slide. And as a result, ended up at the dueling fields in New Jersey. And so this is an area where Hamilton's brilliance was not matched by an emotional growth that hopefully would have been concomitant with that.
What was it? Was it 8 or 9, or how many affairs of honor was he engaged in his
11.
life? 11. Only one which led to a dueling ground.
And ironically, one of them was solved by Aaron Burr, was as an intercede when he helped out to calm passions. But yes, only one. And that occurred, at the end of his life. His firstborn son was dead, defending his honor. He had failures in his public life in that Jefferson was president, and to his gall, with some minor aid from Hamilton. And so I think that the Burr conundrum hit at just the worst possible time. He's 47 years old. He feels he's a failure. He talked about the constitution's a frail and worthless fabric that he'd spent years propping up, a thing of milk and water. Those are a lot of signs of depression, and he simply then, in that mindset, could not let it go when Burr challenged his honor.
There were times when these two New Yorkers, Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, were friendly and even engaged in some activities.
They were co-counsels on lawsuits. And there's one famous one where Hamilton got an award of $144,000, which you can imagine in that time was a stunning award. Hamilton, the lead lawyer, billed $1,000, and Aaron Burr, the backup lawyer, billed $2,500, which says something about Burr, as well as Hamilton.
So for many years leading up to the summer of 1804, they'd been kind of circling each other, warily, increasingly tense. They'd been involved in political contests where each one felt bruised and misrepresented by the other. Finally, there's a dinner party in Albany where Hamilton says something, maybe in his cups, but he says something that is then related indirectly to Burr. And when Burr hears it, he says, I have no choice now. I have to force Hamilton to clarify this.
I believe it was the Albany Register had a story reporting on this party. It said that a number of the gentlemen had spent the evening saying horrible things about Aaron Burr, and then said General Hamilton stated that he had an even more despicable opinion of him, which I shall not relate here. So Burr's first letter to Hamilton, of the 11 that went back and forth, demanded to know what he meant by despicable. Now, Jefferson, I think, would have just ignored the letter. Hamilton could not. He actually wrote back with a long list of Burr's sins and said, I don't know which one you're referring to. If you could consult this list, please tell me, and I'll know a little more. And it just went downhill from there.
So, all right. So if you had to guess what the allegation that Hamilton made or is said to have made in Albany was, what would you say?
There are historians who say that there is enough evidence to say that Burr had an inappropriate relationship with his own daughter, an incestuous relationship, which, as you can imagine, would be just about the most vile thing you could say of a person. And there has been speculation that that is what Hamilton said.
I don't think that's true. I mean, I know you're reporting accurately, but I think that's wrong.
Yeah.
Burr's relationship with his daughter Theodosia is extraordinarily interesting. They wrote
really
about classical languages and culture. He treated her like a full-on equal. He was a feminist of a certain sort. Yeah. He was enamored of the work of Mary Wollstonecraft. This is a man who had a kind of 21st century relationship with his daughter, and the allegation that it was somehow too intimate, I think, is a really irresponsible thing.
And that's why, as in character, I do not say that. And when people ask this question, I say, it doesn't matter, I shall keep to myself.
So, all right. So now my mother-in-law used to say, in a conflict, you can ratchet up or you can ratchet down, and you should always ratchet down. But Hamilton, as you said,
Only ratchet up.
letters, he's going to ratchet up. He had 3 or 4 opportunities during this crisis to let this slip away, and he couldn't. And you're going to say, all right, his son had died in a duel defending his father's honor, that his political career was largely over, etc. But there's a death wish here in some sense.
There, some scholars have said that specifically. They think he wanted to die. He was just, he had passed from significance publicly. He had, in his own private life, he had purchased 30 acres of farmland in Harlem, which is no longer the farmland, of course. But he wrote to a friend, I'll say this just to irritate you. He wrote to a friend, I have, in the course of 3 years, raised a crop of asparagus and strawberries valued at $18. I'm as ill-fitted to be a farmer as Jefferson is to be at the head of the nation.
Well, what strikes me as so interesting is that now that he has wealth, after he finally retired from government, he began to accumulate some wealth. And so what does he do with it? He buys a rural estate. It doesn't sound rural to us, but it was. Upper Manhattan was still a rural countryside then. And so he decides to join the landed gentry, which seems so un-Hamiltonian.
It really is, and it did not work.
All right, so back to the duel. All right, so they ratchet up, and finally, and I think Burr was willing to let it go at, a couple of times. Burr has a sort of nonchalance about life that poor Hamilton never had, but they finally get out there. And so short answers here. I know this is a very complex subject. Did Hamilton decide to throw away his fire? By which we mean make a plausible sort of shot, but shoot to miss.
Well, the seconds that each gentleman had, William Van Ness for Burr and Nathaniel Pennington for Hamilton, wrote a report. Both wrote reports. And the only thing they disagreed on was who fired first. I think the evidence is overwhelming that Hamilton did, in fact, fire over Burr's head on purpose. And I mean, well, we know for a fact that he fired over his head because his pistol ball struck a branch and clipped it off, which Pendleton went the next day and collected. I've always wondered what happened to that branch. It would be an amazing thing to have.
A Hamiltonian relic now.
It would be. So yeah, worthy of veneration, perhaps. All
right, so
I'm convinced Hamilton threw away his fire, yes.
So it's possible that, there's a whole hair trigger controversy. Right. Possible that he just panicked and fired badly, but I assume that he did not intend to kill or even hit Aaron Burr.
One of two things has to be true. If he fired first, he deliberately fired over Burr's head. And if he fired second, he fired after being struck by the musket ball and fired over his head. And as further evidence, when Hamilton was being loaded into the boat to be rowed back across for the primitive medical care was available, he saw his own pistol and he said, "Take care, for it is still charged and may yet do injury." He thought he had not fired. He wrote to his friends he would not fire. So I think it's pretty clear he threw away his fire.
All right, so let's say that's true, and this is acceptable under the code of honor.
Yes.
It has to be a plausible shot. You can't just shoot it into the ground. But if you shoot to miss, and the other person shoots to miss, then you either have a second round or you shake hands and say, "I have cleared my honor."
Yep, exactly.
Let's row back across the river. So Burr, for whatever reason, shot Hamilton in the lower back.
The side, actually.
And it shattered his nerve structure, I believe.
It did. He was when you stand, you stand side to side. That is to say, with your arm extended out from your side to present the smallest target possible. Yeah, and Hamilton was struck there. It did sever his spine.
Burr has gravely wounded Hamilton.
Yes, he would die
and we
the
know
next
that
day.
Hamilton is going to die 30 hours or so later. Yeah. He had written a couple of letters before he went, including to his wife, and he dies. Now the Vice President of the United States has killed the former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, and even though Hamilton's star has fallen a considerable amount by 1804, he's still one of the most notable and extraordinary Americans. This is national news.
Oh, absolutely.
If there had been Fox and MSNBC in that era, just imagine that story. Burr continues to preside over the United States Senate. Jefferson drops him from his second term, although it had nothing to do with the duel.
No.
And I don't know, Jefferson never really talked about the duel. He wrote one puny little letter to his daughter, Martha, from the White House, in which he said, yeah, not much going on this summer. The following things have been happening. Oh, and yeah, Colonel Burr killed Hamilton in a duel. And that was it.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't say, thank goodness he's gone, or I abhor dueling, or this is my vice president. Now what? This is a scandal. Jefferson just reports it as if it's just some little news blip he read somewhere in a newspaper. So this is very Jeffersonian, of course, that detachment. Sure. Who knows what he actually felt? And, as a Jefferson performer, I have a disadvantage over a Hamilton performer because Jefferson doesn't tell us how he feels. But right. Hamilton often tells us how he feels.
And it's usually grumpy.
So, all right. I've been to the dueling grounds. Have you?
I have not.
My daughter, Catherine, and I went to the dueling grounds a couple of summers ago, and we reenacted the duel. We stood. It's all urban now. It's really just there's a slight little park element, and there's a little monument there. But there's not much. It's in Wehaukon, New Jersey, across from Lower Manhattan, and so we reenacted it. Did a little video. They went there, and this is the last question I'll ask about the duel. They went there because they were out of the jurisdiction of New York, right?
Correct. And New York specifically at that time had outlawed dueling, and New Jersey had not. But nonetheless, the dueling ground was actually, as you know, kind of a little flat spot on halfway up the bluff to the main area where the farmer lived, who was really tired of duelists coming over to his property and exchanging pistol shots at dawn.
All right. So just one last thought about this, and a question. First, my thought, and then a question for you. If you're a Freudian, or if you're a psychologist or psychiatrist, the key fact in this is going to be that his son Philip, just a couple of years earlier, was cut down in a duel on that very spot, and so that haunts this story.
With the same pistols.
A lot of the discussion is about pistols and about hair triggers and about etc. But the part for me that's heartbreaking is to think that Hamilton's son threw away his life defending his father's problematic honor, and that Hamilton had to live with this, the guilt of it. You're a father. You must have a sense of how profoundly upsetting and destabilizing that would be.
Absolutely. It was, we're both fathers. The most horrific thing that could occur in one's life would be the death of a child. And if that child died because of you, in the way, regardless of rational or irrational, that would be very difficult, frankly, to survive, I think. And one of the challenges, which I know you know far better than I do, a person will ask in a performance sometime about, let's say, Hamilton's religion. And the problem is that there are different eras of his life where he had different religious beliefs. In that horrible beginning in the Caribbean, he was a pretty religious guy. One could argue out of desperation. For the bulk of his career, from perhaps 18 till 2 or 3 years before his death, he was at best an agnostic. And then, although again, as was the style of the time, references to the Almighty were made in writing a lot. And that's what some people get wrong today. And then at the end of his life, after Philip's death, he became intensely religious, actually called for a Christian constitutional party, although it's not clear how serious he was, as his own life cascaded downward. So it is, I cannot imagine the burden, especially when one arrives on that halfway up that bluff, as the seconds are doing their little chores and pistols are being loaded, to think about the enormity of what had happened there just 2 years before, and it was your fault.
So agreed with you entirely on that, Hal. Let me ask this question as we sort of close this second segment of this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour with Hal Bidlack, Colonel Hal Bidlack.
Lieutenant Colonel. I don't want to brag.
I always demote Hamilton and promote you. I always call him Colonel, and now it's your Lieutenant Colonel Hamilton. Does that designation stay with you through life?
It does. It depends on what one wishes, I suppose. When I actually returned to the academy for a couple of years as a civilian professor, rather than be Dr. Bidlack, they just still call me Colonel Bidlack. And for Colonel or Lieutenant Colonel, the informal term, just like lieutenant, first lieutenant, second lieutenant. In casual conversation, I'd just be Colonel Bidlack. So it's not necessarily a promotion, but I would take. But yeah, I think it depends on how one defines himself. I mean, I find that I cannot let my hair grow past my ears after 25 years of military service. And yet I know friends who have retired and grown the most magnificent beards and ponytails and mullets you can imagine. And they would never refer to themselves as military, but I'm a pretty military kind of guy, I think, after my 25 years. So yeah, I still think of myself that way.
We have 1 minute before the break. It's an impossible question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What do you think would have happened to Hamilton had he lived to die in his sleep at the age of, say, 70?
I think, frankly, very little. At this point in his life, he had already demonstrated whatever influence he had. His great aegis, George Washington, was gone. He had his great adversary, Jefferson, was in the White House. I think Hamilton's influence was at a nadir that he would not have recovered from. So honestly speaking, he might have had more success in business, but I think politically he was done.
We're going to take a short break. We're talking with Lieutenant Colonel Hal Bidlack of Colorado Springs. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson in a one-on-one interview with Lieutenant Colonel Hal Bidlack. Hal and I have been debating, he, Hamilton, I, Jefferson, for a quarter of a century or more in many venues. And in fact, I remember we did one in Michigan during the contested election of Al Gore and G.W. Bush. And I think the Supreme Court decision came down the evening that we were to perform. And Michigan is a place dear to you, of course. So Hal, at the end of his life, Hamilton feels like his power is gone, his usefulness has been diminished. Yes, he can make a lot of money and so on, but that's not really Hamilton's goal in life. And yet, he probably felt that his vision of America was being repudiated by the great success of the Virginia Jeffersonians. What he couldn't know was that in the long run, his vision was going to triumph and Jefferson's was going to be ghettoized as a kind of a quaint Virgilian idea of the family farmer and the chosen people of God and all of that America was going to become exactly what Hamilton had in mind. It's going to become an industrial giant, a key player in the world's arena, a nation with a very strong central government, and that banking and stock markets and speculation were going to be a central theme of American life, and that in our time, America is more about getting and spending, which is not Hamilton's dream, than it is about anything else. So in the long run, Hamilton wins and Jefferson looks a little odd, but he didn't sense that in 1804.
Did not. And I think one of the tragedies of Hamilton's short life is that at that time he could not turn around and see sitting behind him an adoring wife and 7 children. It was just irresponsible to let Burr gall him into actually shooting pistols at each other. When I'm performing as Hamilton, I'll say at the end of his life, there was a shadow across it. And what kind of shadow was it? Was it a brief or a long? And it was just a brief shadow before the nation did become, as you've described, an industrial giant. One of the things I think you often quote Jefferson quite aptly is talking about the earth belongs to the living. They could not anticipate in their era the remarkable thing like a steam engine or a telegraph, or to say nothing of the internet. Sometimes I get asked, what would Hamilton do today? And I always say, well, Jefferson would be on the internet for hours trying to learn everything that could be learned, and Hamilton would be there trying to figure out how to make things, how to sell things there. It's a world that neither of them could envision, but Hamilton, because of his understanding of human nature, I think ended up being more right about what the future would bring.
I want to get this on and off the table pretty quickly. In popular national memory, and including in the musical Hamilton, Hamilton is seen as a kind of womanizer. And there's the allegation that he had an unnatural relationship with his wife's sister, Angelica Schuyler Church, and that there were innumerable mistresses, and that I think Abigail Adams said when he walks into a room, you can see him looking around for the woman he'd like to seduce, and John said even more gross things about all of that.
Yes, we shall not quote.
So what's the truth here? I mean, he had this wife, Elizabeth, and 7 children. There were 8 children, including the one that was killed in a duel. Yeah. He clearly had the relationship with Maria Reynolds. We won't go into that, but he was set up in a blackmail scheme with a couple. How serious is the truth or the allegation of kind of serial womanizing?
I think it's nonsense. The evidence is that until the Maria Reynolds affair became public, with one of 2 colossal publishing stupidities in Hamilton's life, when he published a 96-page pamphlet explaining he had cheated on his wife, but not on the government, which was the allegation of the blackmailers. Until the Maria Reynolds affair came out, there was not a single report or claim or letter or anything claiming that Hamilton was having affairs. After Maria Reynolds, his enemies began shouting from the rooftops, "Oh, this is just he's bedded hundreds of women. This is the kind of guy he is." I think that's not true. I think that he was a guy with certain faults, like all of us. I honestly do believe that Maria Reynolds was the only case. The fact that Elizabeth stayed with him and her wonderful dressing down of former President Monroe when they were both late in life is further evidence that this was, I think, historically a one-time deal. If you don't control the press and your enemies survive you, you can't stop the stories from being told.
I want to talk about temperament. I'm thinking of the cabinet of George Washington. You probably know Lindsay Chervinsky's great book on the cabinet, which has really helped my thinking about this. There are only a couple of cabinet ministers. So there's the Secretary of War, there's the Secretary of State, there's the Secretary of Treasury, and there's the Attorney General. And that's Washington's cabinet. And Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, has a big portfolio, one that he didn't particularly embrace. Hamilton is sort of behaving like a prime minister. He knows that he's the favorite, and he also knows that there are some vacuums in the cabinet that he can fill with his own mighty capacities. So here's how I see it. I see Jefferson, whether he's posing or not, as a consummate Virginia gentleman, seemingly above the fray, a little soft-spoken, bewildered by the struggle of power in the world, turned off by conflict, and behaving with exquisite manners as if he were a character in a Jane Austen novel. And he and Hamilton could get along well enough socially, but Hamilton appears to me to be a classical policy wonk, a term that didn't exist in his time. But he's a policy wonk, and he's hard-driven, and he wants to get things done, and he wants to debate, he wants to duke it out, he wants to settle matters. And it must have really frustrated him to have Jefferson there with that kind of aloof, gentlemanly detachment when Hamilton wants to struggle and clarify.
I think there's a couple of things that we have to remember about that first cabinet. The first is Jefferson was at a disadvantage because, 6 months before he could get there?
He'd been in France, and he took some time in Monticello before he joined the administration in New York.
But the other, I think, important thing to remember is that this is the very first cabinet. So there are no precedents for how this organization is supposed to behave. So if you look toward European governments, which Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison and everyone did, Hamilton has a famous letter in which he talks about the Minister of Finance dominates as essentially prime minister in many of these countries. So Hamilton's elevation of himself to a position above just one among equals is, I think, from 2 things. One, the fact that Washington loves him, and I always love pointing out that on every matter of substance where Washington had to make a decision, he picked Hamilton's side over what Hamilton called the Virginia junta. But that today, if, say, the Secretary of Commerce attempted to co-opt leadership in the President Biden's cabinet, we would find that very odd. But in the very first cabinet, there were no rules, there were no histories, there were no precedents. So Hamilton, looking at European governments and assuming that the Minister of Finance is the person who should be the chief minister to the executive, makes a lot of sense. So I don't see it as a seizing of power, as more of an assumption of what were assumed powers.
Fair enough. But what about his attitude towards Jefferson's gentlemanly detachments?
I think he would be perplexed, because I remember you told me once, Jefferson and Hamilton together in Philadelphia or New York might be seen walking arm in arm, and then they would go back to their apartments and write horrible things about each other. I think Hamilton had difficulty with fully integrating Jefferson's gentlemanliness and his support, say, of Callender and things like that.
So at one point during the contested election of 1800, Hamilton calls Jefferson, quote, an intellectual voluptuary.
Yes.
What do you think he meant?
I think that he was actually condemning Jefferson for what is actually one of Jefferson's greatest strengths, which is the notion of being a polymath, that lots of things are interesting. When you and I perform together, you often have a fun introduction in which you kind of mock Hamilton's narrowness of focus. I think Hamilton was being critical of Jefferson, saying this guy is interested in so many things. Some prairie dog on his desk will distract him when the British are invading.
Very good.
Well,
he never said that, but I'm glad you did.
The listeners will recall the election of 1800 was thrown into the House of Representatives. Adams, the theoretical nominee of Hamilton's party, was a non-factor. Jefferson and Aaron Burr, his vice presidential nominee, which is a whole interesting story as to how Jefferson picked Burr, tie in the Electoral College, and I believe it was 73 votes apiece. Before the 12th Amendment fixed the problem, the assumption made in Philadelphia at the convention was that the best two men, as indicated by the first and second finishers in the Electoral College, will become president and vice president. And that's how Jefferson became Adams' vice president. But then as... in
the election of 1800, 73
right.
votes to 73, Jefferson defeats John Adams, who gets 69 electoral votes, but he ties with his VP, Aaron
right.
Burr, which creates a constitutional crisis, even though, as you freely admit, everyone in the country knew that Jefferson had been elected president and Burr was to be vice president, but the Constitution didn't know that.
So they've tied, and now it is thrown into the House of Representatives where each state gets one vote. So it's not it's a simple 13 votes. Hamilton realizes that Burr is just a terrible danger. So he writes this letter to James Bayard, who was the delegate from Connecticut and is the only delegate. And in this letter, he says a lot of things. And he says, of Jefferson, I admit that his policies are tinctured with fanaticism, that he is too much in earnest in his democracy, that he has been a mischievous enemy to the principal measures of our past administration, that he is crafty and persevering in his objects, and that he is not scrupulous about his means of success, nor very mindful of the truth, and he is a contemptible hypocrite. But by every virtuous and prudent calculation, Mr. Jefferson is to be preferred. He is by far not so dangerous a man as Burr, and Jefferson has pretensions to character. And
so some of that seems true or has truth in it to me.
But it's certainly spiteful.
Jefferson is ideological. He's enamored of France. Jefferson is a little bit devious in some of his political machinations. That Jefferson does not always tell the truth, although I think Hamilton exaggerates that problem.
That's
Jefferson
fair.
somewhat. Yeah. I think contemptible hypocrite, does that sort of what John Adams thought, that Jefferson pretends to be above the fray, but in fact, he's just another politician?
I think so. In another letter, Hamilton wrote that Jefferson most earnestly quests after the presidential chair, which is, as you know, quite an insult in an era when you had to appear to be uninterested in office and forced against your will to the public call. It is not clear that letter to Bayard was the single most important factor, but ultimately on the 36th ballot, he withholds his vote for Burr, making Jefferson president and Burr vice president. Burr came to Jefferson and said, all right, now what do you want me to do? And Jefferson said, well, perhaps you could take a hike on a short pier.
But Jefferson, of course, was always seemingly gracious, but he never forgave Burr for entertaining the notion that the Federalists might install him rather than Jefferson as the third president of the United States. So back to the cabinet for a moment. Jefferson later said we fought like two cocks in the cabinet, so two roosters. So that suggests a little less Jane Austen than I was suggesting. But poor Washington regards both of them with deep respect. And in some ways, he respects them equally, in some ways not. So he respects Hamilton as a reliable aide, a loyalist, brilliant policy wonk, somebody who does his homework, who is indefatigable, and who, in a sense, has Washington's back. With Jefferson, Washington seems to see him as an intellectual voluptuary. He's extremely able, a great diplomat, served the country well in France, knows all about wine and sculpture and culture and civilization, and is a polymath and extraordinary, enviable in his genius. But maybe Jefferson isn't precisely one of us. He's a little not quite on board with what we're trying to accomplish here.
Well, and I think two thoughts. The first is that the other thing that Hamilton had going for him, Washington during the Revolutionary War talked about Hamilton's ability to think for him. Now, that is not meaning what some anti-Hamiltonians might argue is that he had brainwashed Washington. What Washington meant was that as the commanding general, the ocean of documents and issues that would come before him, he needed someone who could help him lighten the load and would decide things as Washington would himself, had Washington the ability to get to everything. So I think that Hamilton begins his time in the cabinet with Jefferson with an automatic advantage in that Washington already fully trusts him and his judgment, hence his asking him to redraft his farewell address, things like that. And then I think the other thing that is that Hamilton was so narrowly focused that Washington would get exactly what he wanted from Hamilton in terms of here's a 2-page or here's a 10-page, whatever it might be, exactly answering the question you asked me. And I think Jefferson might too often recall what the Greeks might have done and that type of thing. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, maybe. I think Jefferson, Hamilton, is just like a laser. If there's a problem to be solved, he goes and figures it out to the best of his capacity. And he was a serious student of the British banking system, which was just kind of new. And he knew finance. He had read all of the early economic tracts. Jefferson never really understood finance. And Jefferson's more about the tone of America, and Hamilton is more about the practice of America. What does it take to be an independent nation? And I think Jefferson thought they'll just leave us alone. We can just go about our business and they'll just leave us alone as we pursue agricultural and self-sufficiency and cultural achievement. And I think Hamilton said, no, that's not how a great nation has to operate. A great nation needs an infrastructure. It needs a financial system. It needs central authority. It needs a government that can get things done. It needs efficiency, which is one reason why he helped to call the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And so I just think of poor Washington, admiring both of these men greatly, but differently, and seeing them squabble. And they're both like surrogate sons trying to get the attention of the old man. And I think it broke Washington's heart. And he keeps writing these plaintive letters saying, can't you get along? Just the last thought about this. Yeah. Agreed that Hamilton, in the end, prevailed. That the country desperately needed both Hamilton and Jefferson as its sort of founding visionaries. I want to thank you for joining this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, and I invite you to come back because I have many more questions that get to the Constitutional Convention and constitutional interpretation and so on. So if you will agree to this, we will meet again. Meanwhile, thank you. What book should we read about Alexander Hamilton? Well,
it depends on how much time you want to spend. If you go to my website, hamiltonlives.com, you'll find an annotated bibliography there. I think Richard Brookhiser's book is the short, tight history if you want to read a quick book told by a great storyteller. But I still think that if you want every little detail, Chernow is still the standard. When you
Ron Chernow, that massive tome on Hamilton.
Oh, my goodness. For which we have the musical, because that's what Lin-Manuel Miranda read on a boat when he was on vacation. Those two, I think, to me, are the most powerful. There are many books with lots, including Joanne Friedman's, but there are many interesting things there. But I'd go with Brookhiser and Chernow.
Hal Bidlack, thank you. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program